Hello everybody and welcome to Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and in this video, we'll be looking at two of the most famous commanders in world history, Hannibal Barca and Alexander the Great. By analyzing some of their most iconic battles and victories, we will find out who was the better commander. These men's military careers have countless stories that I could highlight, but I wanted to look at these men at their absolute best to decide who was better. I hope you enjoy the video. Let's get started. Let's have a look at the background of each commander. Hannibal was born in 247 BC to Hannibal Barca. At the age of 10, he was brought to New Carthage on the Iberian Peninsula where Spain exists today. That region was in contestation between the Carthaginians, the residents of the peninsula, and Rome, who was influencing the different peoples there. Carthage and Rome were both vying for control of the western Mediterranean. Hamilcar had come to prominence in Carthage because of his generalship in Sicily against the Romans during the First Punic War. Hannibal's father would die on campaign in Iberia, leaving Hasdrubal, Hamilcar's son-in-law, to command the region. Hasdrubal had distinguished himself in campaigns with his father-in-law, but was assassinated, leaving Hannibal in charge. The young Hannibal had sworn an oath in his younger days before he was allowed to go on campaign to always fight against Rome, Carthage's arch-nemesis. Hannibal took his oath to heart and quickly, after taking military command in Iberia, attacked Saguntum, a town in alliance with Rome. This got Rome's attention, and war was declared, starting the Second Punic War. At this point, Hannibal was 26 years old as he prepared his army to march into the Italian peninsula. A caveat needs to be added here, because we don't have a whole lot of sources for Hannibal, and most, if not all, are from his enemies. Now, let's look at the other commander's background. Formerly known as Alexander III of Macedon, we most commonly know him as Alexander the Great. Like Hannibal, he was the son of a very successful father, Philip II of Macedon, who had united much of Macedonia under his hegemony and brought most of Greece into the Macedonian Empire. Alexander was born in 356 BC to Philip and his wife Olympias. By the age of 16, Alexander was leading troops in the battle alongside his father. But when Philip was murdered, Alexander became king of Macedon at age 20. His father had already planned an invasion of Persia and assembled an army for that purpose. In Alexander's 22nd year, he crossed the Hellespont and invaded Asia Minor, intent on defeating the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was vast and made up of various peoples from Egypt to India. Their king, Darius III, had become king the same year that Alexander became king, and over the next couple of years, the two would meet each other on the battlefield for domination of the empire. Now that we have become acquainted with each commander, let's examine their ability to lay siege. Honestly, this will be short on Hannibal's part. Hannibal's only significant siege was against Saguntum on the Iberian Peninsula. It lasted 8 months, mainly because of a lack of capable engineers. For Alexander, as he made his way down the eastern side of the Mediterranean, he had to lay siege and capture multiple towns. However, the one I want to point out in great detail is his siege of Tyre, his longest siege. The old town of Tyre laid right alongside the coast, but the new town was built on an island in the Mediterranean Sea. Alexander requested a sacrifice in Tyre to the temple of the Greek equivalent of Heracles, but the Tyrians refused. An angry Alexander laid siege to the island city. His engineers built a causeway to the city from the coast, roughly a half-mile long. To protect his engineers and builders, siege towers were fashioned to ships with catapults on top to heave large stones into the city. The siege of Tyre was an engineering masterpiece. Once the Macedonians breached the walls, the city quickly capitulated. Alexander slaughtered 8,000 Tyrians and enslaved the rest, roughly 30,000. While Alexander entered the temple to sacrifice, his men were crucifying 2,000 Tyrians along the coast as a deterrent for any city that might consider resisting him. In fairness, Hannibal's only significant siege was Saguntum, and the city most historians criticize him for not laying siege to was Rome itself. However, Hannibal knew his weaknesses and his strengths, which led him to cause havoc on the Italian peninsula rather than attack a well-fortified city. I consider a commander's ability to conquer a major aspect of being a great commander. But Hannibal wasn't a conqueror. When he invaded Rome, he did not seek to destroy it, but to weaken it, so that Carthage could control more of the Mediterranean. Perhaps he would have moved against the city of Rome had he been able to use the full military might of Carthage, but he didn't. He was severely limited. His concern was over control of Sicily, the Iberian Peninsula, and Numidia, which Rome had started to influence politically and militarily in the decades preceding Hannibal's invasion. Once the Carthaginian commander found himself on the Italian peninsula, he solidly defeated the Romans in 3 major battles and multiple lesser engagements. The Romans decided not to engage Hannibal, but to simply harass his army. Hannibal then began to take over Italian cities, weakening Rome's control over the peninsula. However, gradually, Rome would take back those cities. Hannibal could not control those areas effectively. Granted, he did stay on the peninsula for about 15 years, a feat unmatched by hardly any other commander. His diplomatic relations with the Italians waned throughout his stay. Alexander, on the other hand, created one of the largest empires in history, spanning diverse regions and peoples, although not entirely responsible for Hellenization of Persia, because there was already an exchange of ideas and goods between Persia and Greece for hundreds of years. He did create a more streamlined exchange by making it part of one empire, and after his death his generals divided up the empire, but they were Greeks, making the exchange of ideas and goods easier. Alexander conquered territories, and either through intimidation or good choices, placed loyal satraps or governors in each territory, making an easy transition for the inhabitants. Although there were a few problem satraps, for the most part his empire held together while he was alive. Alexander adopted Persian ways, which angered and confused many of his Greek commanders. But the more familiar he made himself with his Persian subjects, the more likely they were to stay loyal to him. He was a good administrator of conquered land. Now, let's look at what we have all been waiting for, their military skill in battle. For this analysis, we will look at the Battle of Gaugamela for Alexander and the Battle of Cannae for Hannibal. Arguably, these are each man's greatest victories and are a good representation of each man's style. The Battle of Cannae occurred after Hannibal had soundly defeated the Romans at the Battle of Trebia and Lake Trasimene. Fabius, the Roman consul, chosen to confront the Carthaginians, refused to engage with the enemy, but decided to harass Hannibal in a guerrilla-style warfare, which gives rise to what we understand as Fabian tactics or strategy. Rome would get fed up with this style of warfare and double the size of the army to confront Hannibal to 70,000 men. The preparation for battle demonstrates Hannibal's genius. He never wanted to engage the enemy on their terms or terrain. He took great pains to make them attack him. Hannibal did the same thing at the Battle of Lake Trasimene, where he positioned the Roman army perfectly for a secret attack that trapped the enemy between themselves and the lake, drowning and killing nearly the entire Roman army. At Cannae, Hannibal placed his weaker troops, many of them mercenaries from Gaul or North Africa, in the center, while his veterans occupied the wings. His cavalry guarded the flanks, as usual. Hannibal had chosen the location and knew from the size of the Roman army that they would be unwieldy. He also had great confidence in his cavalry, who had bested the Romans on countless occasions. When the Romans hit the Carthaginian center, it held for a few moments, but then began to buckle. This was going exactly to Hannibal's plan. As the enemy pushed the center further back, the veteran wings turned inward, trapping the Romans on 3 sides. The Carthaginian cavalry, after scattering their Roman counterpart, turned around and hit the enemy from behind. The Romans were completely captured, but the weak center was beginning to break, threatening to allow the enemy a way to escape. Hannibal, uncharacteristically, rode into the fight to encourage his men and to help hold the line. In true Hannibal fashion, he tried not to let the enemy get away, either by slaughtering them in mass or capturing them. By nightfall, roughly 50,000 Romans were dead, including 80 senators or senatorial candidates, and 20,000 were taken prisoner. It is disputed how large Hannibal's force was, but he was outnumbered, and a historical consensus is that he had around 40 to 50,000 troops under his command. Alexander had spent nearly 5 years in Persia, taking over Anatolia, the eastern Mediterranean, and Egypt. He finally marched towards Babylon and Darius' force. Ancient sources estimated that the Persians held a 1,000,000-man army, but most likely it consisted of around 100,000 soldiers, far outnumbering the Macedonian force of around 40,000. Prior to the battle, Darius' engineers had leveled the ground where the battle would take place, making sure the Macedonians could not use the environment against him as it had during the Battle of Issus. This would be the biggest test for Alexander. He arrayed his phalanx in 2 lines with his cavalry and many of his skirmishers on his right flank. Alexander rode with his cavalry on the right flank, and this is one of the biggest differences in the 2 commanders. Hannibal rarely fought personally, but Alexander almost always engaged the enemy, sometimes to his detriment. The Macedonian cavalry rode to the right in an attempt to occupy the Persian cavalry, and it worked. The skirmishers were able to engage and lead the Persian cavalry away from the main body, allowing Alexander to lead an attack into the Persian main line. This demonstrates a flaw with Alexander. He was wrapped up in battles and not able to coordinate his army. While he was trying to attack Darius personally, his left flank was beginning to crumble. If Darius hadn't have ran and caused panic in the Persian troops, it is likely the Macedonian line could not have held out. Alexander had to double back and help his flank. This battle solidified Alexander as king of Persia, and he would claim king of Asia. So, what is my verdict? Looking at the critical points I mentioned, Alexander was better. However, I want to add a caveat. Alexander had the luxury of being a king, an ultimate authority. Hannibal was a commander, albeit a commander with a lot of power, but he was subject to the government of Carthage. If he had had supreme power, how would his campaigns have looked? In siege warfare, Alexander was ruthless, and Hannibal was unable to compete with the engineers available to Alexander. When it comes to conquering, I hate to compare them because Hannibal wasn't a conqueror, but for a commander of their rank, it is a necessary aspect. Although Alexander was arguably the better commander, if I was looking for a commander to lead my army, I would go with Hannibal. Alexander took too many risks, especially endangering himself. Going toe-to-toe in a formal engagement, personally, I believe Hannibal would come out on top. It would also be a sin not to mention Hannibal's miraculous march over the Alps with war elephants to invade Rome, but I want to save that discussion for a later video. Thank you all so much for watching. I know I may have left out a key aspect of each commander's campaigns that you would have wanted mentioned, but I wanted to present each man at their best and aside from those instances. There is so much more to talk about with these 2 that I may have to do a part 2. Please let me know in the comments below what other commanders you would want me to look at. This video was suggested by someone and I liked it so much I made it into a video. Thank you all so much. Have a great day.
Historian, where do you roam? Historian, far from home. If history will travel, reads the card of a man, a professor with knowledge in the hard land. To educate the world is his mission. A professor of fortune is a man called historian.